In our previous videos about the Indian indentured labor, we explained the colonial past of several nations, how the system was operated, and what the Indian communities underwent in those countries, especially after the independence from the British. The British had taken Indian laborers to many of their colonies. One such colony was the island nation of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, officially the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, it is the southernmost island country in the Caribbean, consisting the islands of Trinidad and Tobago, and numerous smaller ones. Little is known about the history of these islands before Christopher Columbus landed there in 1498. However, we do know that by the 1300s, the island of Trinidad was populated by Arawak and Carib people. These populations were largely wiped out under the Spanish encomienda system, which pressured the indigenous people to convert to Christianity and labor as slaves in exchange for military protection. By 1700s, Trinidad belonged to the Viceroyalty of New Spain, and in an effort to populate the island, King Carlos III issued the Cédula de Población in 1783, that granted free lands to any foreign settlers and their slaves in exchange for a sworn allegiance to the Spanish crown. As a result, numerous French Martinique Creole planters, along with other Europeans, settled in Trinidad and developed its sugarcane and cacao industries. Meanwhile, there were numerous attempts by European powers to settle Tobago during the first half of the 17th century. Large number of forts were constructed as Tobago became a source of contention between France, Netherlands and Britain, and the island changed hands numerous times prior to 1814. Trinidad was part of the Spanish Empire until 1796, when Sir Ralph Abercrombie surrounded the island with his 18 warships, thereby forcing the Spanish governor Don José María Chacón to surrender the island to the British. And by 1802, the territory became an official colonial subsidiary of the British Crown. Trinidad's sugar and cacao industry was extraordinarily profitable, and the African slaves constituted the majority of the labor force on the plantations. But with an 1838 Act of Parliament abolishing slavery in all British territories, Trinidad's agricultural economy teetered on the verge of collapse as the newly freed Africans refused to work any further on the plantations. To prevent complete disintegration of the sugar and chocolate industries, Chinese, Portuguese, African Americans, and, most notably, Indians were shipped to Trinidad as indentured laborers. Of those, Indians proved to be the most resilient and ready workers, and as a consequence, they were thus recruited in greater numbers than those from other countries. On May 1, 1845, first batch of 217 Indians was brought to Trinidad, and indentureship of the Indians lasted until 1917, during which time 143,989 Indians came to Trinidad to work on sugarcane plantations. The conditions on board the ships during the long journey were cramped and depressing, with frequent outbreaks of diseases. On arrival in Trinidad, these immigrants were quarantined on Nelson Island and then assigned to the various estates for the contracted 5-year period. In order to qualify for the free return passage back to India, however, the laborers had to re-indenture themselves for a further 5 years to an employer and occupation of their choosing. Otherwise, they had to bear the expenses of the return travel. Indentureship contracts were sometimes exploitative, to such an extent that historians such as Hugh Tinker called it a new system of slavery. Coercive means were often used to retain laborers, and the indentureship contracts were soon extended to 10 years from 1854 after the planters complained that they were losing their labor too early. For these immigrants, life on the estates was bound by the terms and conditions of the contract. They could not demand higher wages, leave the estate without permission, or refuse the work assigned to them. The basic minimum wages stipulated in the contract was 25 cents per day for men and 16 cents for women. They were often made to work longer hours than stipulated. Furthermore, there were penal sanctions for breaches of the indenture contract. The laborers found without passes outside the boundaries of the estate were jailed. Other offenses carrying jail sentences included willful disobedience, threatening or verbally insulting the employer, and deception in performing work. The courts were heavily weighted against these poor Indians and excessive sentences were often unfairly imposed upon them. Very few of them actually understood the immigration ordinances, could defend themselves or pay for legal aid. Each revision of the law saw penalties becoming more stringent and comprehensive. In theory, there were a number of apparatuses put in place for the well-being and protection of the immigrants, but these were often ineffectual. Also, too few immigrants lodged complaints for the fear of victimization, as was the case in all the British colonies. By the 1870s, Indians had proven themselves as the virtual backbone of the sugar industry in Trinidad. However, during the 1880s, a depression was looming over the British West Indian sugar industry. Planters withheld the wages, extended tasks and harshly treated the laborers. This caused strikes and disturbances on some of the estates in Trinidad, including the Cedar Hill Plantation and the Jordan Hill Plantation, and resulted in Husay Massacre of 1884. The estate life had become irrevocably unattractive for the Indian laborers. They began moving off the estates in large numbers to become independent farmers, settling on and cultivating lands granted to them through the land commutation scheme, or that they had purchased from the state. Hence by 1902, more than half of the sugar cane in Trinidad was being produced by independent farmers, the majority of which were Indians. A significant number of Indians also went into cacao and wet rice cultivation. Despite the trying conditions experienced under the indenture system, about 90% of the Indian immigrants chose, at the end of their contracted periods of indenture, to make Trinidad their permanent home. Few Indians settled on Tobago, however, and the descendants of African slaves continued to form the majority of the island's population. Up until this point, the Indo-African contact was next to negligible in Trinidad. Indians in the colony were subject to certain laws which segregated them from the rest of the population, such as the requirement that they carry a pass with them if they left the plantations, and when freed, they were required to carry a certificate indicating the same. Eventually, these two people groups started having more contact with each other by the end of the 19th century, by which point Africans were well established. They were now landowners and occupied jobs in the public sector. Majority of them were already Christianized and looked down upon the alien and supposed inferior faiths of the new arrivals, exactly as their former masters had done to theirs for centuries prior. But despite conversion attempts by the British colonialists, most Indians stuck with their faith, whether it was Hinduism or Islam. All of these elements combined to ensure that the island's African-descended population would not willingly seek to establish close relations with the then unskilled and unlettered newly arrived Indian indentured laborers. For the most part, these newcomers were left to themselves, in and around the rural sugar estates, and essentially excluded from the mainstream of the island's colonial society for several generations. Also, there was a reluctance to mingle and adapt on the part of the Indians, who mostly stayed in rural areas in their own communities even after the end of their servitude. This meant that the two communities stayed at bay from each other for a long time and were very wary of each other. Furthermore, the British, particularly the Christian missionaries, did their best in stereotyping the communities, thereby fueling the fire of racism. The Africans must have felt unsettled by the Indians, as they had been on the islands far longer and were destined to be the dominant people group. Indians, on the other hand, must have viewed the Africans with indifference and also as the accomplices of the British, as they were often hired to police the Indians. Being at the bottom of the barrel, and having the largest populations of all the ethnicities in Trinidad and Tobago, both of them have had to fiercely compete with each other for limited resources and opportunities, which furthered the racial divide. Negative perceptions of the Indo-Trinidadian population began to change markedly in the early 1950s when the descendants of Indian immigrants increasingly began to acquire land, establish their own private agricultural ventures, and more especially vigorously pursue education and increasingly enter the professions. The racism and hierarchy that was a product of the British imperial system continues to affect race relations and patterns of political power in Trinidad and Tobago even now. Since Trinidad and Tobago's independence in 1962, Both communities have voted mainly along the racial lines, with Afro-Trinidadians mainly supporting People's National Movement and Indo-Trinidadians supporting United National Congress. Today, both have roughly the same populations and are often at odds due to something or the other. But their differences in dislike for each other did not prevent them from borrowing certain religious aspects from one another and be impacted by the other's culture. Lastly, both have contributed immensely to the Trinidad and Tobago's culture, food, festivals, customs, music, dance and fashion. This in turn has unknowingly shaped the island nation into a melting pot of a diverse culture.